It's February, so it's the perfect time to talk about vampires. Let's jump right into it and talk about our favorite vampire games of all time. Starting off at number 10, Bloodrayne came in that weird early 2000s wave of vampire games that just kind of popped up out of nowhere for some reason. But anyway, Bloodrayne was pretty hotly anticipated at the time, with a crazy ad campaign and a lot of hype behind it. So when it finally came out, it was a huge relief that the game was actually really cool. The game sees you playing as Rain, who's a Vampyr, which, if you're unfamiliar, it's just the fancy human vampire hybrids like Blade being a daywalker, except instead of being a cool dude like Wesley Snipes, you're a cool goth lady, and instead of hunting vampires in Detroit, you're murdering the hell out of some Nazis in Germany and Argentina. It's a pretty fast and fun third-person character action game with Rain just cutting through Nazis and then just sort of leaping at them and sucking their blood for health regen. It was a simple but effective concept with some really fun combat and some light environmental puzzle elements, and was actually one of the first games post-Max Payne to incorporate that style of bullet time slowdown into the action, which is pretty cool. Now, we know some people prefer some of the sequels, Bloodrayne 2 especially, but the original debut title holds a special place in our hearts, which is why we're including it here. Next, at number 9, so Darkwatch is interesting right out of the gate because it's the only first-person shooter on this list, which is a surprising rare genre for games with vampires in them, it turns out. Darkwatch has you playing as Jericho Cross, a wanted outlaw, Civil War deserter, and a member of a vampire hunting guild called the Darkwatch, but is slowly turning into a vampire himself after an encounter with a vampire lord. The game does some cool stuff with Jericho struggling with his humanity over the course of the game, but the really cool stuff is in the gameplay. It played incredibly well with tight responsive controls and pretty solid level design with a decent amount of variation. You also were able to unlock new powers and abilities based on the player's choices and the reputation system. The game was also solid with multiplayer, at least on Xbox, where there was a 16-player online competitive multiplayer as well as a 2-player co-op mode. It was pretty well rounded and even looked damn good at the time, but unfortunately it just kind of fell by the wayside in a crowded space and never got any other releases, which is a damn shame because the game really is surprisingly good. Coming in at number 8, we have Infamous 2: Festival of Blood. This is a standalone what-if Infamous story where Cole becomes a vampire and has to defeat the vampire that turned him by dawn in order to return back to normal. It was actually a pretty fun game. It was still Infamous 2, but it was all vampired up. For example, instead of wielding Cole's amp, you're using some cross wooden stake type thing. You can also run around and suck the blood out of civilians without really worrying about what it does to your karma, seeing that it's a game about being a vampire and you gotta eat. Makes sense. You had some new powers too, like turning into a flock of bats and flying around the city. This came out a few days before Halloween, actually in 2011, and it was a cool little what-if story to enjoy around the holiday. Yeah, sure, it was a little goofy, but you got to play as vampire Cole McGrath, so honestly, who really cares? Next up, at number 7, we have SKYRIM Dawnguard, which technically isn't a standalone game, but is instead an expansion for Skyrim. But it's so cool, we had to include it here. The coolest thing about Dawnguard are the options that come with it. You can play as a member of the Dawnguard, a group who has dedicated their life to hunting and killing vampires, or you can join the clan of vampires that they're hunting. Each group has their own benefits to joining, but the vampire clan probably has the coolest perk. If you decide to become one of them, you get a whole new skill tree, and you can turn into a vampire lord, which is a monstrous bat-looking creature. Dawnguard also had a pretty cool story with the main baddie planning on using an Elder Scroll to block out the sun, and I don't have to explain how bad that is for humans and how good that is for vampires, right? But yeah, no, it was cool. Vampires have always been an important part of the Elder Scrolls series, and it was really nice to get a main questline that was all about vampires. And at number 6, we'd be total goofs if we didn't mention Castlevania. We gotta give the whole series some love. As members of the Belmont clan, in most instances, it's your sworn job to slay Count Dracula and other evil creatures. And face down against Count Dracula, you very much do in many of the games. It's a legendary series for a reason, from its humble beginnings to Symphony of the Night, and most recently it's worth mentioning the Lords of Shadows games, because, spoiler alert for games that are now quite a few years old, you are the vampire. These games serve as a setup for Dracula himself, and while it's a big reveal for Lords of Shadows, and it's the main thing of Lords of Shadow 2 when you're full vampire, the first game is definitely a little bit stronger. Classic Castlevania is somewhat shaken up with bigger battles and sequences like the early God of War games, and then in Lords of Shadow 2, you get some pretty cool vampire abilities at the very least. Still, we think most of the Castlevania games are worthy of some love, so we had to talk about the series here. And at number 5, Vampyr is awesome and is one of the more unique vampire games on this list. There's vampire combat, sure, yeah, you suck blood, but it's not the strongest element of the game. The focus here is on story and dialogue and the choices you make in a plague-ridden London. You're a doctor who is also, unfortunately, a vampire. You have the doctor's oath of saving lives, but you're still a vampire. They need blood or they go hungry, so the question goes down: who do you kill and who do you save? Do you want more vampire powers or good guy points? How much you embrace the creature inside you is the fun of the very mood and dialogue heavy game. There are tons of characters in beautifully broken down environments filled with side quests and hidden alleyways to suck on unsuspecting people's blood if you're willing to lure someone into the dark. Dr. Jonathan Reed is an interesting main character and is one of Don't Nod Entertainment's strongest and most underrated games for sure. It's on pretty much every platform now, so you should consider checking it out. And at number 4, The Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing is a Diablo-style top-down action RPG. So if you like vampires and you like Diablo-style games, you're all set. Just like Diablo, you'll be taking on hordes of enemies as Van Helsing, or rather the son of Abraham Van Helsing, seeing that this game follows the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. It's not in the same universe as the book, but instead takes place in a more messed up gothic version of 19th century Europe. But don't worry, the son of Abraham Van Helsing is more along the lines of Gabriel Van Helsing from the Hugh Jackman movie, so you know he's awesome. I think the coolest thing about this game is that it kind of branches off of the OG Dracula novel, and it's a really good book, so yeah, this is cool.
So this is how they welcome folk around here.
At number 3, we have the Soul Reaver games, which are part of the Legacy of Kain series. If you're unfamiliar with the series, you play as Raziel, a vampire who was killed by Kain and later resurrected as a wraith by an elder god so he can kill Kain. Soul Reaver had some really good vampire drama. Kain kills Raziel after seeing his newly grown wings, which I guess Kain saw as Raziel being above him, seeing that he transformed beyond Kain, so out of jealousy, he rips them off and tosses him into the Lake of the Dead. Thankfully, a good video game adventure ensues. The narrative in these games are all honestly very good for the time that they were released, and they were all mostly pretty big games. Soul Reaver was so big that it was actually split into 2, which is why we got a sequel. According to the game's director, Amy Hennig, they had actually over-designed the game. These games go beyond just vampires and expand into some really otherworldly, fantastically 90s world-building stuff. We actually have a whole video about the series and what happened to it if you're interested. Look up What Killed Legacy of Kain if you're curious. And at number 2, Vampyr: The Masquerade Bloodlines is one of those games that just sticks out in your mind as a great game, the presence of vampires completely aside, especially if you're a fan of good PC action RPGs. The game kicks off by just letting you create your own vampire and then having you choose a vampire clan, which in turn alters the experience based on that choice, which is really cool, especially if you're big into game variants and replayability. From there, you're just out in this vampire-infested version of Los Angeles looking for quests and other vampires, and in doing so, building up experience and upgrading your character to better suit your playstyle. It was also really cool because it had both third and first person perspectives based on the context of the scene. If you were exploring or in melee based combat, you're in third person, but the second you switched over to a firearm, it went into first person. It was a pretty interesting way to add some variation and keep everything fresh and exciting if you ask me. Vampyr: The Masquerade Bloodlines is just a really great all-around package combining fun and engaging combat, deep RPG mechanics, and a really cool modern, at the time, vampire story. There's a reason it's still talked about to this day. It was just that damn good. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this game is one of the best vampire games out there. But I'd go so far as to call it one of the most essential PC games of the last 20 years, so if you haven't played it, maybe check it out. Finally, at number 1, we have the Blood Omen games. Just like Soul Reaver, this is part of the Legacy of Kain series, but we thought that Blood Omen and Soul Reaver are both pretty different, so we wanted to acknowledge them separately. Blood Omen takes place before Soul Reaver and helped to build out the series' big baddie, Kain. The first game is where you get to see how Kain went from shitty nobleman to a shitty vampire. For its time, the first game was pretty dark and adult-oriented, which was really cool. It's in this game that Nosgoth and its surrounding lore was introduced, and with pretty insane detail for a video game world. Then we have Blood Omen 2 that actually came out after Soul Reaver 1 and 2, and here you are back to playing as Kain, and it's technically after Soul Reaver 2, but also not really, but instead takes place in an alternate timeline that's created by the events of Soul Reaver 2. This one isn't as good as the previous 3 games, but it's still a blast to play, and the industrial city it took place in was a cool setting change, since Blood Omen and Soul Reaver always took place in a more dark and gothic setting. The Legacy of Kain series was so damn cool when it was still a thing. There was supposed to be a new entry titled Dead Sun, but that was canceled a few years back, unfortunately. And those are some of the best vampire video games, but we want to hear from you, so meet us down in the comments and let us know what you think. Are there any games on this list that we may have missed? What's some of your favorites? As I'm sure you already know, hitting that like button really helps us out, and if you're new here, subscribing is a good idea, because we put out videos like this every single day. As always, thank you for taking the time to stop by and hang out with us. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.